I had driven 6 hours to surprise my son on Christmas, only for him to tell me I was ruining everything. After years of supporting him, I realized he didn't see me as a father, only as a bank. So I did something he never expected. I stopped paying for his life. Hit subscribe if you believe life always finds a way to balance the scales, because this story proves it. I could still feel the cold bite of the December air as I parked my car outside the small suburban house my son had called home for the last few years. Christmas lights twinkled along the roofline. Neighbors bustled with last-minute shopping and laughter drifted from other homes. But I felt uneasy. Excited, yes, but uneasy. I had been looking forward to this drive for months. The idea of surprising him for Christmas had kept me going through a long week at work, and I wanted him to feel that warmth, that sense of family I had always tried to give him. I clutched the little bag of gifts I'd packed carefully, thinking of each one as a reminder of all the Christmases we had shared before he moved out. I had saved for months to make sure I could afford something special for him, not because he needed it, but because I wanted him to know I cared. I had driven 6 hours across icy roads to see him, my heart full of hope that maybe this year, despite the distance and the business of our lives, we could have a quiet moment together. Just the two of us, laughing, remembering old times, sharing stories by the fire. But as I stepped up to the door and rang the bell, the sound of it felt too loud, too intrusive, almost like it echoed in a space that didn't want me there. His wife opened the door first. I hadn't seen her much in person, and her polite smile barely reached her eyes. And then he appeared behind her, arms crossed. That same expression I remembered from his teenage years. One that used to mean stubbornness or teenage angst, but now it carried something colder. "Dad," he said, almost a question. And then the words hit me harder than any fist could. "You're ruining Christmas." I froze. The words hung in the air like an icy wind, cutting through the warmth I had carried all the way from home. "Ruining Christmas," I repeated slowly, almost hoping I had misheard. "Yes," he said, shaking his head as if I were insane. You just don't get it. You shouldn't be here. You're ruining everything." I stared at him, trying to process the disbelief, trying to make sense of it. "I just wanted to surprise you," I said, my voice unsteady. I thought we could." "No." He cut me off sharply. "You can't just show up. You can't just assume we want you here. It's awkward. Really awkward. And it honestly, Dad, you should have stayed home." My chest tightened. I felt a sudden wave of anger and hurt, a combination of heartbreak and disbelief that made my hands tremble slightly. I had spent years working hard to make sure he wanted for nothing. Rent, car payments, phone bills, gifts every birthday and Christmas. I had done everything I could think of to make sure his life was easier, smoother, more comfortable than mine had been at his age. And now this? He wasn't even angry at me for something I had done wrong. Not really. He was angry because I existed, because I was trying to be a father, and somehow that was a burden to him. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell him how much I had sacrificed, how many late nights I had spent worrying about him, how many times I had put my own needs second just to make sure he had everything he wanted. But the words caught in my throat. I didn't want to argue. Not here. Not like this. So I took a deep breath and nodded slowly, as if to say, "I hear you." Which, of course, was a lie. I didn't hear him. Not really. I heard rejection. I heard disrespect. I heard the cold reality that the son I had raised no longer saw me as a parent, no longer saw me as someone worthy of his time or affection. And maybe he never had. I stepped back from the doorway, careful to keep my composure. "Okay," I said softly, almost mechanically. "I understand. I'll go." I didn't wait for him to respond. I turned and walked back to my car, the snow crunching under my shoes. I felt every mile of the 6-hour drive I had just completed as a weight pressing down on my shoulders. The bag of gifts felt heavier than it should have, like it contained not just presents, but all the hope I had carried for this reunion. And now that hope had been shattered, leaving a hollow ache in its place. As I drove back home, I replayed his words over and over in my mind. "You're ruining Christmas. How could my presence be ruining anything?" I had dreamed of this moment for weeks. I had imagined the joy on his face, the laughter, the warmth, and instead rejection. Cold, unfiltered, absolute. I remembered the first Christmas after he had moved out. He had called me, excited, to tell me about his apartment, his decorations, the little tree he had set up. I had sent gifts, of course. I had even wired money to help cover a few extra expenses, and he had sounded happy, grateful even. But in retrospect, I realized that gratitude had never been genuine. It had been automatic, expected, like a paycheck rather than a heartfelt "thank you." It stung to admit, but I had to face the truth. Over the years, I had been more of a provider than a father. I had made his life easy, comfortable, convenient. But had I made him better? Had I taught him responsibility, respect, appreciation? Or had I only taught him entitlement? The night stretched on as I sat alone in my living room, staring at the twinkling lights I had put up for myself, for my own comfort, to remind me of Christmases past. I remembered him as a little boy, running to the door to greet me, his face bright with excitement, his laughter filling the room. I remembered baking cookies together, decorating the tree, reading stories late into the night. And now, those memories felt almost like a dream, distant and fragile, as if someone else had lived them. Anger began to simmer under the surface, slow and deliberate. Not anger at him for speaking, but at myself, for letting this happen. For letting years of sacrifice be met with indifference, with rejection. For allowing him to think that I existed solely to make his life comfortable, that my presence was optional, that my love could be measured in gifts and bills. And then, a thought began to form, quiet at first, like a whisper in the back of my mind. If he thought I was just there to support him, then maybe it was time he learned what life was like without me doing it all for him. Not to punish him, at least not exactly, but to teach him. To show him that independence isn't just about moving out or having money. It's about respect, responsibility, the understanding that love and family aren't services to be used at your convenience. The idea was radical. It felt almost daring. And yet, the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. If I continued as I had been, I would only be enabling the very entitlement that had led to this moment. I would be teaching him that it was acceptable to reject me, to dismiss me, to tell me I was ruining everything, while expecting me to fix it all. I shook my head as I sipped my coffee, staring out the window at the snow falling quietly, almost peacefully. This was my choice. My decision. I would not act out of anger. Not in a way that could destroy him, but I would act in a way that demanded acknowledgement. I would step back, silently, and let him face the consequences of a life he had come to expect without effort. It wasn't revenge. It was reality. And as I sat there, a quiet determination settled over me. This Christmas would be different. This year, he would understand. He would learn that respect isn't optional, that love isn't a transaction, and that the comfort he had taken for granted had come at a cost. A cost he had never recognized until now. The thought gave me a strange, almost guilty sense of satisfaction. Not pride, not joy. Something subtler, harder to describe. It was the satisfaction of knowing I was taking control of a situation that had spiraled too far into imbalance. I had always believed in gentle guidance, in soft lessons, in kindness as a tool for teaching. But kindness had its limits. And perhaps, finally, it was time to test those limits, not to harm, but to awaken. I glanced at the clock. Late now. Too late to turn back. The road ahead wasn't just the 6 hours I had driven earlier. It was a road I had never wanted to travel. The road of setting boundaries, of stepping away from enabling behavior, of letting the consequences fall where they may. And yet, despite the ache in my chest, despite the sting of rejection, a part of me felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. For the first time in a long time, I was choosing myself. I was choosing dignity. I was choosing to act not just as a provider, but as a father, a real father, who loved his child enough to let him face reality, even if it hurt. The snow outside continued to fall softly, blanketing the world in white, serene and indifferent, and I knew that this Christmas, everything would change. Not with shouting, not with anger, but with silence and consequence. And for the first time in a long time, I felt ready. The days after that Christmas visit were quiet in a way I hadn't anticipated. Not the gentle, comforting quiet of a peaceful home, but the heavy, suffocating quiet that presses against your chest and leaves your mind racing. I went through the motions at work, answered emails, returned calls, but my thoughts kept drifting back to him. My son, the boy I had raised, the man who had told me I was ruining Christmas. Every word replayed in my mind, sharper and colder, each time I thought of it. You're ruining everything. It's awkward. You shouldn't have come. I poured myself a cup of coffee one morning and sat by the kitchen window, watching the snow settle on the trees. I tried to remind myself that this was his house, his life, his choice. That as an adult, he had every right to set boundaries. But it wasn't just that. I knew the truth now. The rejection was about more than Christmas. It was about me, about what I had given him, about what he had come to expect without ever acknowledging it. And that's when the memories started coming back, in a flood that I hadn't been prepared for. I remembered the long nights, working double shifts to make sure the rent was paid, when he was between jobs, the time I drove across town in a blizzard to deliver his car payment after he forgot to pay it himself. I remembered the countless Christmas mornings, sitting quietly as he tore through gifts, smiling, laughing, never pausing to think that each package came at the expense of someone who had sacrificed so much to put it under the tree. I realized then that I had been more of a benefactor than a father. I had been giving him a life, not teaching him how to live it. I had softened every struggle, smoothed every obstacle, and shielded him from the consequences of his choices. And in return, what had I received? Disrespect, rejection, a blunt, ungrateful dismissal of my presence, as though my love and sacrifice were nuisances rather than gifts. I sipped my coffee and stared at the swirling steam, feeling a bitter taste at the back of my throat. This wasn't about money. I had enough to continue supporting him if I chose, though it had never been easy. It was about something far more important: respect. Recognition. The understanding that the years I had poured into his life mattered. That the sacrifices I had made were not invisible. That love isn't a service, and kindness isn't an obligation. For hours, I sat there thinking, turning the possibilities over in my mind. I could confront him, demand an apology, make him see how wrong he was. But confrontation had never worked between us. He had always responded with defensiveness, with anger, with a kind of pride that refused to admit error. No, if there was to be a lesson here, it would have to come quietly, subtly, in a way that forced him to reckon with reality without me lecturing him. The idea began to take shape slowly, almost imperceptibly. If he truly believed I was there only to make his life easy, then perhaps it was time he learned what life was like without me doing it all for him. Not to hurt him, not out of spite, but to show him the truth. Independence isn't about moving out. It isn't about money. It isn't about convenience. Independence is responsibility. Independence is respect. Independence is understanding the value of what others do for you. I knew the path wouldn't be easy. It would require restraint, patience, and the ability to resist the temptation to step in and fix things when I saw him struggling. I would have to let him face the consequences of a life he had come to take for granted. And that scared me. Scared me in a way I hadn't expected. Because beneath the anger and hurt, beneath the sense of betrayal, I still loved him. I always would. But love, I realized, sometimes means letting go. Letting go of control, letting go of enabling, letting go of the easy path, and trusting that the lessons you need to teach will be learned in their own way. I began to make a quiet plan. The first step was small, almost imperceptible. I would stop covering things I had been covering for years without question. Rent, bills, car payments, extra luxuries. I wouldn't announce it. I wouldn't threaten it. I would simply stop. Let the reality sink in. Let him feel the consequences of a life where someone else wasn't there to make everything right. It wasn't cruelty. It was balance. It was teaching him that comfort must be earned, not assumed. The more I thought about it, the more I felt a strange sense of liberation. I had been carrying this weight for decades. The weight of being the silent provider, the fixer, the one who always made sure everything ran smoothly while keeping my own needs in check. Now, finally, I was giving myself permission to step back. Not entirely, of course. I wasn't cruel enough to abandon him completely. But I would no longer be complicit in his entitlement. I would no longer make it easy for him to dismiss me, to disregard my presence, to tell me I was ruining his life while expecting me to fund it. I made a list, as cold and practical as any business decision. Bills that I would stop paying immediately, services I would discontinue, luxuries that would no longer be available at his convenience. I checked it twice, like I was preparing for Christmas, except this time, the gift was reality. The first name on the list was rent. He had been living in a small apartment I had helped him with since he moved out, and I had been covering half of the rent quietly, without fuss. That would stop. Next was his car payment. I had signed years ago and had been covering any missed payments. That would stop too. Utilities, phone bills, extra spending money. All of it would end. I felt a pang of guilt as I wrote the final item on the list. The small Christmas gift I had planned for him. I put the pen down and stared at it. Could I cancel it? Could I really deny him something he had come to expect every year, no matter how thoughtless he had become? But then I thought of the words he had spoken. "You're ruining Christmas." He had already ruined the idea in his own mind. And perhaps, just perhaps, removing the gift would be a small but powerful reminder that Christmas, like life, isn't just about receiving. It's about respect, about appreciation, about being present in a meaningful way. The next days were a strange mixture of anxiety and resolve. I watched the mail come in, expecting notices of unpaid bills, letters from landlords, small signs of disruption that I knew would eventually reach him. I resisted the urge to call or text, to explain, to smooth things over. That was the hardest part. Every instinct in me screamed to fix it, to make it easier, to protect him from discomfort. But I held firm. I had made this choice, and I knew that if I wavered now, the lesson would be lost. I thought about calling him, of course. Just to warn him gently, to let him know I wasn't abandoning him entirely. But I realized that any communication would dilute the impact. He had dismissed me, rejected me, treated me as though my love and support were nuisances. He needed to experience the absence of that support firsthand. It would be uncomfortable, perhaps even painful, but it was necessary. And as the days passed, I noticed something subtle shifting inside me. The anger and hurt were still there, but they were mingling with a sense of empowerment, a quiet strength that I hadn't felt in years. I was reclaiming a part of myself that had been buried under decades of sacrifice and silent compromise. I wasn't punishing him. I was asserting boundaries, asserting dignity, asserting the value of my own presence and effort. I began to reflect on the broader implications of this choice. This wasn't just about money or gifts or bills. It was about identity, about what it meant to be a father, about the kind of man I wanted to be, and the kind of man I hoped my son would become. I realized that if I continued enabling him, I would be complicit in the very entitlement that had led to this moment, and that I could not allow. I imagined the coming days, the ripple effects that would inevitably occur. Calls from his landlord, notices from the utility company, the anxiety of realizing that he was no longer insulated from the consequences of his choices. I knew it wouldn't be easy for him. I knew it might be uncomfortable, even humiliating. But I also knew that growth rarely came from comfort. Lessons weren't learned in ease. They were forged in struggle, and so I waited, patient, resolute. I watched the snow continue to fall outside, blanketing the world in white, indifferent to the dramas of human lives. I felt a quiet anticipation, like the stillness before a storm, knowing that the next chapter would be challenging, but necessary. I had made my choice. I had drawn the line, and I was ready to see what would happen when reality finally caught up with him. I thought about him as a little boy again, laughing, running to greet me at the door, eyes wide with wonder. I thought about all the times I had smoothed his path, all the moments I had sacrificed for him, all the quiet ways I had given my love without expectation of return. And I realized that love wasn't diminished by setting boundaries. Love wasn't negated by tough lessons. Love, in its truest form, demanded courage, not just for the one receiving it, but for the one giving it as well. And with that thought, I made a quiet promise to myself. This Christmas, he would learn something more valuable than gifts or money. He would learn that life requires responsibility, that respect is earned, not assumed, that independence is not given, it is taken through effort, accountability, and understanding. And perhaps, through that lesson, he would come to see the father who had loved him all along. Not just the provider who had made his life easy. It didn't take long for the first signs to appear. A week after I had quietly stopped covering his expenses, the first phone call came. My son's voice was sharp, urgent, and tinged with panic, though he tried to mask it with anger. "Dade, what's going on with my rent? The landlord called me today, saying I haven't paid." I sat back in my chair, listening carefully. I could hear the disbelief in his voice, the frustration as he tried to figure out what had happened. I didn't respond immediately. I let him speak, let him vent, because this was the first step in a long lesson he had to learn. His panic, his confusion, his realization that life wasn't automatically taken care of. That was the point. "Wait, what do you mean you're not paying it?" he demanded. "You always pay it. What changed?" I kept my voice calm, neutral, almost gentle. "Nothing has changed except that I'm letting you handle it yourself now." There was a pause on the other end of the line, a silence thick with disbelief. Then, the anger returned, louder this time, almost shaking the phone. You can't do that!" "I need your help. How am I supposed to cover all of this?" "You've always handled it." I could hear the sense of entitlement in his voice, the expectation that I would continue to make everything easy. But I didn't argue, didn't try to justify myself. I simply waited, letting the weight of the reality sink in. "You'll figure it out," I said quietly. "It's your responsibility now." He shouted a few more words, accusations and frustration mixed together, before slamming the phone down. I could practically hear the echo of it across the line. I felt a pang of guilt, as any parent would, but I reminded myself this was necessary. Every struggle he now faced was a reflection of the life he had been handed without effort, and now he would have to confront it on his own terms. Over the next few days, I watched from a distance as the consequences unfolded. Emails from the landlord, late notices from the utility company, texts from his friends asking if he needed money. Everything he had previously ignored, assuming I would cover it, now landed squarely on his shoulders. I didn't gloat, didn't take pleasure in his struggle, but I did feel a strange sense of satisfaction. Not malicious satisfaction, more like a quiet validation that my choice was right, even if it was uncomfortable for both of us. One evening, my phone rang again. It was him, and this time the tone was different. It wasn't just panic or anger. There was desperation under the surface, a vulnerability that had never been there before. "Dade, please. I need help. I can't do all of this alone." I hesitated, feeling the familiar tug of instinct, to swoop in, to fix, to save. But I stayed firm. "You can," I said softly. "You just have to. You've been capable of handling more than you think. Now it's time to prove it to yourself." There was another pause. Then the voice cracked, a rawness I hadn't heard in years. I don't know if I can. I feel like everything is falling apart." I swallowed hard. I wanted to reach through the phone and offer comfort, to tell him it would be okay. But I knew that this was exactly the moment he needed. A confrontation with reality, with the life he had been insulated from, with the consequences of his own expectations. "You'll manage," I said again, calm and unwavering. "You have to. You're stronger than you give yourself credit for." The following days were tense. I could sense the frustration growing with every missed payment, every reminder notice, every minor crisis he had previously assumed I would handle. The first real Christmas tree he tried to set up in his apartment leaned awkwardly to one side because he didn't budget for the proper stand. The lights flickered unevenly, and he spent more hours than he cared to admit untangling them. Small, everyday inconveniences became monumental tasks because he had never truly learned how to manage life without me smoothing the way. I didn't interfere. I didn't offer advice unless he asked directly. I let him call, text, even shout at me. Every moment of discomfort was a lesson, and slowly, I began to notice subtle changes in his behavior. The initial arrogance, the sharp entitlement, began to erode. He still struggled, still complained, but there were moments, tiny, fleeting moments, when he paused and tried to think things through on his own. One evening, he came over to my house unexpectedly. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the strain in his eyes. "Dade, I know you're not going to pay for me," he said cautiously, as if testing me. "But I don't know what to do. I feel lost." I watched him, noticing for the first time the vulnerability that had always been hidden beneath his bravado. "It's okay to feel lost," I said. "It's part of learning. You're learning to handle your own life." He ran a hand through his hair, frustration and embarrassment mingling on his face. "I never realized how much you did for me, how much I took for granted." I nodded. That was the acknowledgement I had been waiting for, the crack in the wall of entitlement. "I know. And that's why you need to do this yourself now. Not because I don't care, but because you need to understand responsibility. You need to see what it's like to manage your own life, without relying on someone else to fix everything." He sighed deeply, a mix of relief and lingering resentment. "It's hard," he admitted. "I feel guilty, like I should have appreciated it more before." "You should have," I said quietly. "But guilt alone won't teach you. Actions will. You have to make changes, face challenges, and learn from the mistakes you make along the way." The tension between us was palpable. a silent acknowledgement that the dynamic had shifted. I was no longer just the provider. I was the parent setting boundaries, the one demanding respect, the one teaching lessons that weren't easy or comfortable. And he was beginning to understand that life without me covering every detail was much more difficult than he had imagined. As the days drew closer to Christmas, the stress intensified. He had to juggle bills, plan meals, buy gifts for his family, and manage 100 small emergencies, all without my silent intervention. And yet, despite the chaos, I saw sparks of growth. He started budgeting, making lists, asking questions, but this time, not to get me to fix things, but to understand how to handle them himself. There was a moment, one quiet night when he called me late, voice subdued and hesitant. "Dad, I think I understand now. I really do. I didn't realize how much I depended on you. I'm sorry for everything, for saying what I said, for not appreciating what you've done for me all these years." I felt a lump in my throat, the mixture of pride and lingering hurt, almost too much to bear. "I know," I said softly. "And that's why you're learning now. Not because I wanted to hurt you, but because I love you enough to let you face reality. Respect and responsibility are lessons that can't be handed to you. They have to be earned." There was silence on the line for a moment. Then he spoke again, quieter, almost reverently. I get it. And I promise you, I'll try to do better." I smiled, though he couldn't see it. This was progress. This was the shift I had hoped for. The confrontation had been uncomfortable, yes, even painful, but it had also been necessary. He was beginning to realize that life wasn't automatic, that support had limits, that respect and gratitude weren't optional. The tension hadn't completely lifted. There were still moments of frustration, still moments where he expected the old patterns to return, but the cracks in his entitlement were becoming wider, letting in the light of awareness, responsibility, and humility. And I knew, deep down, that the hardest lessons were the ones that hit hardest, and that these lessons, though uncomfortable, would shape the man he would become. That Christmas, the tree still leaned a little crooked in his apartment. The lights flickered, and the small gifts weren't all perfectly wrapped. But something far more important had changed. He had begun to see what it meant to live without taking for granted the sacrifices of others. He had begun to understand the weight of responsibility, and with it, the value of respect. And though the confrontation had been difficult, even heartbreaking at times, I knew it was only the beginning. There were more lessons ahead, more growth to come, more opportunities for him to prove that he could rise to the occasion. I had planted the seeds, and now it was time to watch them take root. The days following the confrontation were quieter, but not peaceful. There was a tension that lingered in the air every time I thought about him. Every time my phone buzzed with a text or call, I found myself reflecting constantly, not just on what he was going through, but on what I had done, what I had chosen. I had stepped back, withdrawn my financial support, and watched him face the consequences. And yet, a small, gnawing doubt lingered in the corners of my mind. Was I being too harsh? Had I pushed him too far? I couldn't shake the memories of him as a child, so full of laughter and wonder, running into my arms on Christmas morning, eager to show me the little things he had made, or the stories he wanted to tell. I had wanted to recreate a piece of that magic when I drove to his house that first time, only to be rejected. But now, I wondered if I had overcompensated in my own way, if I had spent so much time trying to shield him from hardship that I had inadvertently spoiled him, leaving him unprepared for the realities of adult life. I walked through the park one afternoon, the winter air crisp against my cheeks, and thought about the choices I had made. Each step on the icy path felt deliberate, grounding me in the reality of what I had done. I had withdrawn, yes, but not cruelly. I had given him the space to stumble, the space to feel uncomfortable, the space to learn. And yet, watching him struggle, even from a distance, was harder than I expected. I thought about the phone calls he had made, the frustration in his voice, the panic, the eventual acknowledgement that he couldn't rely on me for everything. There was growth in those moments, yes, but there was also pain, guilt, and confusion. I wondered how much of it he would carry forward, how much would stick, and how much would be lost in his stubbornness and pride. The complexity of parenthood struck me all over again. Love intertwined with responsibility, boundaries intertwined with compassion, guidance intertwined with patience. And then came the twist, the moment I hadn't entirely anticipated. One evening, I received a text from him that was brief but significant. "Dad, can we talk?" That's all it said. No explanation, no apology, just a simple request. I stared at it for a long moment, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to call immediately, to run to him and reassure him. But another part of me understood the importance of letting him come to this on his own terms. When he arrived at my house later that night, his posture was stiff, his hands buried in his pockets. I could see the strain in his eyes, the way he shifted nervously, almost like a child, trying to find his footing in unfamiliar terrain. And for the first time in weeks, I felt a surge of both relief and apprehension. Relief that he had taken the first step toward acknowledgement. Apprehension because I didn't know if he was ready to truly see the consequences of his actions. We sat in the living room, the soft glow of the lamp casting shadows across his face. He avoided my eyes at first, fiddling with the edge of his jacket, then finally looked up and spoke. "Dad, I've been thinking. About everything. About what you did. What's been happening, and I think I understand now. I really do." I nodded slowly, giving him the space to continue. "Go on," I said quietly. He swallowed, then took a deep breath. I never realized how much you did for me. How much you sacrificed. I thought it was just normal, I guess. That you would always be there, handling things, making my life easy. I didn't see it as love. I saw it as, like it was just supposed to be that way. Hearing him speak, I felt a mixture of sadness and validation. Sadness for the years he had taken for granted, for the years I had been invisible in my own sacrifices. Validation because he was finally seeing, finally understanding, finally acknowledging that my love had always been there, even if he had failed to recognize it. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice softening. "For what I said on Christmas. For everything. I didn't mean it. I was wrong." I let the words sink in, allowing the moment to breathe. I wanted to respond with comfort, to tell him that it was okay, that we could move past this. But instead, I chose patience. "I know," I said quietly. "And that's why I stepped back. You needed to see what it's like to take responsibility, to face the consequences, to understand what it means to truly live your own life." He nodded, his shoulders slumping slightly, the tension in his body easing. "I get it now. And I think I needed it, even if I didn't want it at the time. I've been relying on you for too long, and it's made me selfish, I guess entitled. I didn't realize until now how much I needed to change." The weight of his words pressed against me in a way that was both comforting and heavy. Comforting because he was beginning to understand, beginning to grow. Heavy because the lessons had been harsh, the struggles real, and the path forward was still uncertain. Change isn't instant. Growth isn't linear. But the acknowledgement, even tentative, was a step in the right direction. We talked for hours that night, slowly peeling back layers of misunderstanding, resentment, and unspoken expectations. I shared memories, reminders of his childhood, the quiet sacrifices I had made without complaint. I let him speak freely, letting him voice his frustrations, his regrets, his guilt, and through it all, I felt the subtle shift, the first real connection since that fateful Christmas day when he had told me I was ruining everything. There was a moment when he looked at me, eyes glistening, and said, "I don't want to take you for granted anymore. I want to do better. For you, for me, for us." I reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. The gesture was small, simple, but it carried years of love, disappointment, hope, and forgiveness. "You will," I said softly, "but it takes time, and it will require effort. That's part of the lesson." He nodded again, a mixture of determination and humility settling over him. "I understand," he said. "I really do. And thank you for stepping back, for letting me see, for giving me the chance to change." I felt a deep, almost indescribable sense of relief. Not just because he was beginning to understand, but because the silence, the tension, the struggle, none of it had been wasted. It had led to this moment, to a glimmer of genuine awareness, to a foundation on which we could begin rebuilding our relationship. Yet, even in that relief, I knew the story wasn't over. Change would take time. There would be missteps, frustrations, moments of doubt. But for the first time in years, I felt hopeful that the dynamic between us could shift, from one of entitlement and unearned expectations to one of mutual respect, accountability, and authentic connection. And so, as we sat together that night, talking and reflecting, I realized something important. The lesson, the struggle, the confrontation, it had been necessary. Harsh, yes, but necessary. Love alone was not enough. Guidance alone was not enough. Sometimes boundaries, absence, and the quiet insistence that a person face reality were the only ways to teach the lessons that mattered most. And in that quiet, reflective moment, I understood that the twist of this story wasn't just his realization. It was mine too. I had learned that being a father sometimes means stepping back, letting go, and trusting that the lessons you provide, though invisible, uncomfortable, even painful, will shape the person you love into someone stronger, wiser, and more aware. I looked at him then, really looked, and saw not the child who had rejected me, but the man beginning to understand what it meant to live responsibly, to value love, and to respect those who had sacrificed for him. And for the first time in weeks, I felt the warmth of Christmas not in gifts or decorations, but in the quiet knowledge that growth, however delayed, was taking root. Christmas morning arrived, quiet and crisp, the neighborhood blanketed in a soft layer of snow. I woke early, as I always did, not because I had to, but because it was a ritual I had carried for decades. I brewed a pot of coffee and watched the steam curl into the cold morning air. Thinking about the year, thinking about my son, thinking about how far we had come, the tension that had weighed so heavily on my heart for weeks was still there. Faintly, but it had shifted. Muted, replaced by a cautious hope. I set the table for breakfast, simple but comforting, the smell of freshly brewed coffee filling the kitchen. I wondered if he would come over today, if he would be ready to face me, ready to acknowledge not just the lessons, but the effort I had put into giving him those lessons. The thought made my chest tighten, not with anxiety, but with anticipation, like waiting for a storm to pass and seeing the first rays of sunlight break through. When he arrived, there was a difference in him immediately noticeable. He walked in with a careful step, shoulders straight but less rigid than before, eyes clear, but carrying the weight of someone who had learned something painful and necessary. He wasn't the same man who had rejected me at the door weeks ago, nor was he the entitled young adult who had depended on me for every detail of his life. There was a subtle humility in his stance, a quiet acknowledgement that he was now entering a space he had once dismissed. "Morning, Dad," he said softly. His voice had a hesitancy that spoke of reflection and understanding. Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas? I replied, matching his tone. I gestured toward the kitchen table. Coffee's ready. We sat down, the silence comfortable, yet heavy with the history of the past weeks. It was a different silence than before, less judgment, less frustration, more a shared acknowledgement of growth. For the first time, I felt like we were on equal footing, two people reconnecting. Rather than a father pleading with an indifferent son, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small gift. I know I messed up, and I want to try and make things right. I took the gift in my hands, noticing the care he had put into choosing it. It wasn't expensive or elaborate, but it carried meaning, and for the first time, I saw thoughtfulness rather than expectation. Thank you, I said, genuinely. I appreciate it. He took a deep breath, gathering courage. Dad, I know I took everything for granted. The bills, the gifts, the support. I didn't realize how much you were doing for me, how much you were sacrificing. I see it now, and I want to change. Not just for Christmas, not just for you, but for myself. I studied him carefully, looking into his eyes, searching for sincerity. I had seen glimmers before, but this time it felt different. He wasn't saying what I wanted to hear, he was saying what he had come to understand. I can see that, I said quietly. And that's why this experience mattered. You needed to feel responsibility, to see the value of what's given freely, and to understand that respect is earned. He nodded, swallowing hard. I know I've been selfish. I know I've hurt you without realizing it. And I want to do better. I want to be someone you can be proud of, not because you pay for my life, but because I've earned it. I felt a lump rise in my throat. For years, I had longed for this acknowledgement, longed for him to see the love behind the sacrifices, to understand the weight of what had been done for him. And now, here it was, not forced, not demanded, but freely given through reflection and humility. We spent the morning in quiet conversation, sharing stories of our past Christmases, laughing at the little mishaps and memories that had defined our relationship. For the first time in weeks, I felt the warmth of connection return. Not the superficial warmth of gifts and easy conversation, but the deeper warmth of mutual understanding and respect. Later, he hesitated, then asked, Dad, will you help me with the rent and the bills again? I can manage most of it now, but some things are still tricky. I paused. The temptation to swoop in to ease his burden was strong, but I also knew the importance of balance. He had begun to understand responsibility, but there was still room for him to exercise independence. I'll help, I said finally. But on one condition, you take control from here on. You manage the rest, make the decisions, and handle your responsibilities. I'll support, but I won't fix everything anymore. Relief washed over his face, accompanied by gratitude. He nodded vigorously. I can do that. I want to do that. The afternoon was spent quietly, just the two of us and the remnants of a simple breakfast. We talked about his plans, his goals, the things he wanted to achieve without leaning on me. It was a conversation of partnership, rather than dependency, and I realized that this was what I had been hoping for all along. He wasn't just my son anymore. He was becoming his own man, aware of the consequences of his choices, and ready to respect the love that had always been there. Later in the evening, he helped me decorate the small tree I had put up in my living room, laughing as we struggled to untangle the lights and balance the ornaments. It was imperfect, chaotic, and messy, but it was real. And in that chaos, I saw something I hadn't expected: a genuine willingness to engage, to contribute, and to learn. As the sun set, casting a golden glow across the snow outside, I felt a profound sense of closure. The weeks of tension, confrontation, and emotional upheaval had led to this moment. I had set boundaries, withheld support, and watched him face consequences. He had stumbled, struggled, and learned. And now he was ready to begin a new chapter, one where respect, responsibility, and appreciation would guide his actions. He looked at me, eyes glistening, and said softly, "Thank you, Dad, for everything. For not giving up on me, for teaching me, even if it was hard. I love you. I love you too." I replied, my voice steady, filled with a mixture of relief, pride, and lingering tenderness. "And I always will." But love isn't about giving everything. It's about teaching, guiding, and sometimes letting go so the lessons can take hold. We sat there together, watching the snow fall outside, the quiet of the evening wrapping around us like a blanket. For the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of peace. Not just as a father who had taught a difficult lesson, but as a man who had reclaimed dignity, asserted boundaries, and fostered growth in someone he loved deeply. And in that peaceful moment, I realized that Christmas wasn't about gifts or money, or even perfectly wrapped presents. Christmas, like life, was about connection, understanding, and respect. It was about the moments of growth that come from struggle, the acknowledgement of love that had always been present, and the willingness to face reality with courage and humility. He reached out and placed a hand on mine, a gesture small in its simplicity, but enormous in its meaning. It was a gesture of gratitude, of understanding, of reconciliation. And in that touch, I felt the culmination of weeks of tension, heartbreak, and reflection. The emotional payoff I had longed for. The resolution of a story that had begun with rejection and uncertainty, and the promise of a relationship reborn with honesty, respect, and love. As the evening drew on, I realized that this was the true gift of the season. Not the presents under the tree, not the decorations that lit up the house, but the understanding that relationships, like life itself, require effort, boundaries, and the courage to face difficult truths. And for the first time in a long while, I felt content, knowing that both of us had learned, grown, and begun to truly see each other, not just as father and son, but as two people navigating the complexities of love, respect, and responsibility together.